All right, really excited. I'm sitting down with Marcus Young. I want to say Marcus is an old friend. Like we've been connected for definitely a
I
little
accept
while.
that. Yeah, I accept that gratefully.
You're not old.
Oh,
I am
old enough.
older. We've known each other for a while.
Yeah.
And I just like have so much respect for this man, the work that he does in different parts of the world, his works, his footprint. Like he's just super active in conflict zones. We've been exploring this really big idea of world conflict. I mean, there's so much we could talk about, but at the end of the day, I want to talk to people that are like on the ground, working with people affected by war. And so, just share briefly because we're going to go so deep later. Talk about who you are, what you do, and maybe a little bit of how things got started for you.
Yeah, well, I guess one of the first things I always like to say, because it helps build some context for people, is 4 generations deep in the mission space.
Okay.
So grew up over in Philippine Islands. My dad was born in Burma, which is now Myanmar, and my granddad as well. And so just have some really amazing history of miracles and church movements in a lot of the indigenous areas, the kind of the local, like what we think about like a First Nations kind of peoples, the the older civilizations, of the world versus the
Yeah.
versus the so in a lot of those areas tend to be violent, and have been abused as well, which creates violence in those kinds of situations. So but I have a long-term perspective because of that. So I think that's something worth, like when I'm approaching a problem, I'm trying to look at a bigger picture, and I'm trying to think about a longer term solution. Uh, I, I I was a faith missionary, so I kind of back in early 1994 packed my bags. My wife and I headed out to Thailand, uh,
Wow.
and just went for it. It was tough. Being a faith missionary is not always easy. you know so but that's how we started, and then we've since just kind of grown, built a small organization, work a lot with local people.
Yeah.
A lot of my team is Filipino around the world, Latin America, Africa. uh, do a lot of entrepreneurial things these days, to help empower leaders locally. um, Violence and uh, poverty are very interconnected. So
Okay.
you've got to think about how to address those kinds of issues if you're working from a holistic perspective.
Yep.
So yeah, that's a flavor. I guess people would want to know too. One of my early encounters, I, I was working with a tribe uh, in Myanmar, a little bit in Thailand, Yunnan, China, called the Wa. They're large. Uh, they were headhunters, really the largest drug trafficking army in Southeast Asia,
Wow.
and sent a friend up to, because it's very hard to get into that space, into that area. It's just controlled by too many different armies, and uh, sent him up with a video camera. This was in '97.
Okay.
Said, find me the hardest, darkest place you can, most miserable spot you can. That's where I want us to start working. My theory was, which hasn't really changed, is like if you work in those kind of places, if something happens, it's got to be God. So, and I wanted to do things that I knew were God and not me.
Yeah.
So that's, I kind of tried to choose places that were just too hard for me, but hopefully not too hard for God. And
Wow.
so that he would, so that when things happened, I was involved in making something happen. It just wasn't something, it wasn't the kingdom of Marcus Young. It was the kingdom of God.
Come
So,
on.
and I had an uncle who was former CIA operative who kind of connected me back into some of this space. And this guy came back with footage of child soldiers. I didn't know what a child soldier was. So when he was playing this footage for me, I'm looking at these kids dressed in fatigues running around on this muddy track and saying, why are these kids dressed up like soldiers? And he's like, well, they're Gandoy Lin, which means they're orphan soldiers. And I started asking, why are they orphans? Well, we've had so much war in our area. So actually, statistically at that time, it's like 1 out of every 4 kids was orphaned because of war. So that's just when you're talking about impacts of war. This I've seen the impacts of war. Devastates, just devastates societies. And my heart got broke, you guys. I had like a Nehemiah moment where I just wept, And I
Mhm.
kept weeping for 3 days, and I didn't know. I was clueless to even that God was actually giving me a call. I just knew I had to do something. Got kind of a strategic download of what to do. Chased that for 8 years, failed a lot, kind of gave up, and then we started to see a lot of breakthroughs in accessing these kids. So that's kind of a flavor. So
Yeah,
we're known. We've been known for a lot of our work with child soldiers. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, amazing. So let's go back to something you said really early on, and that is where there's conflict, there's some sort of like you inferred something. So you inferred like someone's being taken advantage of, natural resources are being raped. Can you talk about that, like kind of macro level
Yeah.
when
So
war is happening? Like obviously we don't, none of us think war is good.
mhm.
Um, what's going on with war?
Okay. Well,
Why? Why?
yeah. Why? Yeah. The big why question, right? Well, so so
I mean, I realize it's good in some instances where there's people being bullied, that it's good. Like there's like, hey, we got to stand up to bullies, but let's like go kind of further upstream.
mhm.
Like what are typically bullies doing?
Well, so let's look at it from a couple different angles. So from on one level, there's almost always an injustice at some level.
Yeah.
It's like, you know, so in our current Ukraine Russia conflict, for example,
Okay.
I try to put myself in both shoes of, both sides and just try to understand. So I'm like, okay, so how would we feel if uh, if the Russians were building up arms and controlling all the political elections in Canada?
Yeah.
You know what? Would we eventually like start to get really fed up and really nervous? Well, that's kind of on one level like what was going on with Russia, because we're building up all these arms and we're controlling elections and heavily influencing elections in an area where Russia historically has been attacked through this corridor, multiple times. So just it always pays when you're even looking at a conflict to try to step back and say, okay, what are all the different sides? What are the dynamics? Because we're probably missing a few somewhere. And I'm not saying what Russia's doing is right. I'm simply saying that there was some feelings of injustice
Yeah.
on different sides. I,
Yeah.
I, I definitely, I, I don't think I ever vote for war, right? Because it's just brutal. The realities of it is brutal. So poverty is, like I mentioned, poverty is a big hairbringer of war because there's an injustice people are feeling. Like, so one of the places we work is in Mindanao in the Philippines. It's a place where there's a lot of indigenous people groups. So you've already got splinters of a lot of different kinds of languages and cultures going on.
Mm.
And then they've been abused of their lands. The farmers in these areas, uh, they'll take out loans so that they can get fertilizer and plant, but the loans are always a little too high. So there's a constant rolling debt that they get deeper and deeper into. So, Communist Party comes along and says, hey, we'll fix that for you.
Wow.
And so people will join the Communist Party to, there's different layers of the Communist Party, but one of them's the New People's Army, their actual armed rebel group, kind of like a jungle mafia. And a lot of these people join this because there's an injustice that
Yeah.
they're under and they don't know how to get unstuck.
Yeah.
So you have poverty that is creating a conflict because of an injustice, and then you also, once you start a war, destroy an economy, right? Because
Yeah.
war just tears down infrastructure that takes years and years to build.
Yeah.
So decades sometimes, so you just push people so far backwards by war. And then you've got people in poverty, and then somebody else comes in and oppresses them because we always take advantage of the weak. And so you just
Yeah.
create these ongoing cycles that are just atrocious. But if you fly back all the way, and this is where I like to start, to
Yeah.
the story of the early Genesis story, and you go to the story of Cain and Abel, immediately when we step out of the Garden of Eden, there's a story of violence, right? It's
Yeah.
like we don't get to breathe hardly. You know,
Wow.
we have, however we want to frame it, a disobedience to God that
Mhm.
happens by eating from the wrong tree. And then once there's the exit out of Eden, you have this conflict between Cain and Abel, and Cain kills Abel, right? So there's the blood of the martyrs, or whatever you want to call it. But what's fascinating and terrifying to me is that Cain is, he goes off, he's marked by God somehow, and he goes off and builds a city, and he starts doing all these things. But his entire line, they start building like civilization. So if you read about it, they do metalworking, and they
Mm.
farming, agriculture, uh, they art, music. All these things are developed by this line of violence. Like I think it's Lamech who boasts about killing a young man because he got offended, right? This young man or boy. I mean, it's a violent line that's doing all this that you see culminate in like a flood coming, because God just says, you know what, I'm going to turn you guys over to your sin, because he says every thought of your heart is militant. He actually uses in the Hebrew, it talks about this like militant towards evil. Like there's a strategic militant plan of evil that is just being devised in the human
Wow.
heart. And so the flood comes, but you have the line of Seth, right? Seth is the good guy, where we have Enoch who walks with God and is not, and you have Noah and all those. You never hear about them being very productive other than Noah builds a boat, you know. But it's the line of violence that's building all the civilization. So you go
Huh.
study history,
Wow.
and it's true. It's like even our own, American nation was built in conflict. Whether
Yeah.
you talk about, the conflict with the British, or the conflict with the Mexicans, or the conflict with the Indians and taking territories, it was violent.
Yeah.
So nations are built out of violence. Civilizations are built out of violence.
Wow.
So that's a terrifying, to me, understanding. Well,
Wow.
but it also tells me that the church should really pay attention to this.
Hmm.
Like especially if we're like saying, hey, we're reformers and we want to make change that's positive in the world, then we need to understand how nations actually build,
Hmm.
that they build out of a place of violence. And I assume, and I believe that that's not the way God wants us to build. But then, the question becomes, what's our answer to this? How do we live in a different kind of posture and attitude and strategy if we're not supposed to be building nations out of violence?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And I mean, to me, that sounds like interconnectedness and like recognizing what we do is connected to what others are doing. And can we leverage strengths? Can we get it together kind of vibe as we're being visionary? Because I don't think there's anything wrong with having energy that wants to push things forward, but I guess it's how do you go forward? Do you go forward on people's necks, or do you go forward like kind of, I don't know, some level of
mhm,
we, us together, you know?
yeah. Well, I don't know if I'm being too kind of big picture here,
Yeah.
uh, and maybe we want to get back into some stuff that's a little deeper on the ground, but
We
uh,
will. We'll definitely get back there.
but like so I think about the world, and I actually learned this from working in the human trafficking space, and then and working with child soldiers. Like
Yeah.
it started through some prophetic revelation where there's a young Jewish guy who I didn't even know who he was, but I was at a night watch in IHOP back in, I believe it was 94. No, I'm sorry, 2004.
Okay.
And he asked if he could pray for me, and started talking to me about this political spirit that was going after me. And when he talked to me, it's just like I just started to get some downloads. Like the Lord just started to talk to me.
Huh.
And there was actually a big sum of money that had been raised, like a big chunk, several $100,000, that was caught up in church politics, and
Okay.
I couldn't get access to. And we actually had, at that point, had a big breakthrough with accessing some child soldiers in Myanmar. And he basically told me about, hey, this money's tied up. He said, started over here in this country, it went to this country, then it went to this country, and this ministry and this ministry. It basically was describing how this political spirit had jumped from like a tribal drug cartel over into the church and was traveling through the church. And some of the church was quite apostolic and Holy Spirit people. And it was
Wow.
like kind of scary.
Oh my,
Uh, and but it just like all once started helping me see a bigger picture. And at one point I remember reading through the temptation of Jesus and seeing that each temptation deals with a specific power or principality. So the first temptation is the bread, where Jesus is tempted, and the second one is this is Matthew's version. The second one is the temple, and the third one is the crown. And each one of those represents something in our world, like economics, the bread, right? The temple, religion, the crown, politics. And you can talk about it in money, sex, and power, or economics, socio-religion, politics. And
wow.
what's interesting in the human trafficking space, and this is where I first started functioning with it, and it is, I would see it in, okay, forced labor, the economic space, right? Money, forced sex, this cultural, socio-religious type space, and then forced soldiering with child soldiers in the political space. So I dealt a lot in the political space. And one of my eye openers, I'll just give you another story here, is I was traveling in Thailand. This is probably 2005, I'm guessing, and then in Cambodia as well. And when I first landed in Thailand, um, I got really sick. Like I felt like I had a dream, okay, that the Pope, current Pope at the time, died of pneumonia. I woke up and I felt like I had pneumonia. It felt just awful. So I thought this was really weird. So I got online and checking the news headings, and I see that an article headline says Pope goes in the hospital with pneumonia. I thought, well, that's really bizarre. So I was like, God,
Wow.
what are you telling me? And he's like, when the Pope dies, you're going to see a breakthrough in because the Pope represents a political and a religious spirit, and you're going to see a breakthrough in your own ministry. So I'm like, okay, that's really interesting. So like 3 days later, the Pope was fine. He's out of the hospital. I thought, well, I didn't hear God, and then I'm traveling like dog sick for 2 weeks. It was just awful. Like I had pneumonia, and the and then at the end of that 2 weeks, the Pope dies of pneumonia. Like he has another bout, relapse, dies of pneumonia. The same time he dies, there's a government guy in China, because China was very connected to this area we were in, with the child soldier projects and so on. And he was resisting us getting these kids that we were going to take, even though the local government wanted to give them to us, because they're like, we were the church, right? And he's like, we don't want to give our kids to the church. So he had been resisting us in this whole thing, even though the local government was trying to give us these kids. Well, he suddenly dies the same day, and the whole thing just shifted, and
Wow.
we were given like 50 kids that day, and I got well. Like the whole thing just lifted off me. It was pretty crazy.
Man.
So that was an eye opener for me, because it was one of those moments where I was like, okay, I have so little control over this situation.
Yeah.
I'm just like watching it happen more than making anything happen. I mean, we said yes, we're postured, right? But my power to actually shift things in the heavenly realm was God at work.
Man, that's a dramatic story.
Yeah,
Very unusual.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Very, very, I mean, insightful though to the way things are connected. And
yeah.
so let's do that. Let's go like back under the ground. Like so, big picture ideas around war and violence and maybe how society is pushed forward. So what's the impact at the ground level? Like what do you see? You're working, you obviously mentioned like the natural result of orphans. You got like 1 in 4 people are orphaned in the middle of war. And
Yeah.
I don't know if that's like just a general stat or just specific to a certain
That was
locale.
specific to a certain area, but
Yeah.
I can't remember. I was doing the statistics on it. Uh, did in a blog I wrote or something. but I mean,
Yeah.
uh, you're talking hundreds of thousands of orphans that could come out of this Ukraine war, you know,
Yeah.
uh, that, and you think about the impact on all those kids in the society, because you've got a whole generation that's growing up fatherless and motherless, right?
Yeah.
And because moms and dads are the image of God to children, if you lack that picture, it makes it a whole lot more difficult for people for for the people who grow up as orphans, for them to really connect with the heart of God. So
Totally.
you see how, kind of in the strategies of the devil, disconnecting children from caregivers, it can have really long term devastation on a society.
Yeah.
So because it's not just that, you're not just thinking about the pain of a child who grows up without a mom and dad. You're thinking about their primary access into who God
Yeah.
is stripped away.
Yeah.
So because that really is it is a sociological, it's like the way that God reveals himself to, like, I don't know how many people you've ever run across that if they had a really bad relationship with their, especially with their dads, but with their moms too, how it impacts their picture of God,
Yeah.
right?
Totally.
So, but it is a parents, the caregivers are the picture of God to those
Yeah.
children. That's how it starts to form. So, I don't know. I probably got off on a tangent, but um,
Well, yeah. So the impact of conflict and war
yeah,
and violence, what you're seeing in the areas that you guys work in. So obviously, a lot of fatherlessness, a lot of families being ripped apart. What other kinds of dynamics are you seeing? You mentioned drug trafficking. Maybe drug trafficking flourishes in those settings.
yeah. Well, what happens is whenever,
Sex and labor. I don't know what. Like, talk about what you've experienced and
okay,
witnessed.
so there's again lots of dynamics, but like, uh, so war creates poverty, violence, violence, and poverty are very deeply interconnected.
Yeah.
They're so. But for example, um, you have kids who are hungry, right? So you've got a family, and maybe they got 7 kids, and they're trying to say, how in the world are we going to feed all these kids? Well, if you got conflict going on, and there's more and more poverty, then the
Yeah.
parents are going to be more inclined to say, my kids have the best chance if I send them off with this guy who's going off to this big city, and he's going to let my kids live with some rich family, and maybe they'll get a chance for an education, and they're not going to be hungry. And the next thing you know, you've got children who are ended up being slaves, right? Because they're growing up in somebody's house, and they're owned. And so parents had good intentions. They were just trying their best. I mean, we saw that, I think, in that Afghan conflict that just happened, where the U.S. did this massive exit, right? Just
Yeah.
boom, all at once, they just disappeared from the, you know, it was interesting because, Trump's day, Trump was trying to get the military to leave, and they ignored him. And in Biden's day, when Biden said let's pull out, they pulled out like 2 months early. So the military both times kind of like did something to like hurt the president. So kind of interesting. I'm
Uh,
like, well, so maybe they don't like either president.
yeah.
but but when they pulled out early, it created all this problem, right? Security problem. Well, parents again are giving their daughters away for these early marriages that just terrified us, when we see these stories of these, 5-year-old girls getting, given slash sold to some rich guy. Parents are just trying to save their kids a lot of times in
Yeah.
these situations. It's not that they're evil. They're just trying to do the very best they can to survive and give their kids a chance.
Yeah.
And so I think that's when you're in wealthy societies, you tend to um, have more time to protect and think about your kids, right?
Mhm.
But a lot of times when you're poor societies too, kids tend to be a little bit more of an asset sometimes too. Like your farming community, you're having
Mhm.
kids because you need good farmers, because
Wow.
you can't survive by yourself. You got to have a community. So the mentality shifts as people get wealthier, which is one reason why some level of what did John Wesley talks about, when you have revival, people prosper. And then when people prosper, you need revival
Wow.
because, human beings, we forget God when we have too much ease. So I, I think
Yeah.
for me, if you ever see war and the terror and the destruction that it creates in people and the impacts, it's like the studies, epigenetic studies, where they did these studies on people in World War II who went through near starvation because of war. And fascinating, they the third and fourth generations were traumatized, and like they actually had trauma that they lived in that had been inherited, that went down to the third and fourth generations. It's
Wow.
like it's like the Bible talks about iniquities are passed down to the third and fourth generations. So
Wow.
there's these kind of impacts from war that can be just devastating long term. And I don't remember the exact technical term, but there's some other articles I read uh, where they basically talk about this group mentality that people move into, like Israel because of the Holocaust, where there's just this like sensitivity in your culture because you've suffered a certain way.
Sure.
And you become reactionary in a certain way just because of the way your culture suffered. So I think I'm just trying to emphasize to our audience that we need to understand when we step into a war, it's not about like a 2-year war or a 5-year war, a 10-year war. It's about a 100-year impact.
Wow.
We weren't made for this. It's like I was having a conversation with a friend of mine today who lost a guy he had been working with who had a opioid addiction, and
Sure.
he works in they've got some really great rehab stuff they do, and
Okay.
this guy ended up overdosing and dying the other day, and he was just struggling with it. And I was like, you know what, I've decided that we weren't made for death, and so anytime death happens, it just doesn't, like, there's no good equation. It
Wow.
doesn't work in our heads,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
It can't, we weren't made for it. So of course we're going to feel all messed up and broken because somebody died, because it's not natural. That's not
Yeah.
what we were made for. And so if you think about war as a death machine, we're
Mm.
just multiplying something we weren't created for.
Wow. Yeah.
So the impacts of that are just like atrocious.
So talk about the where you guys have ended up.
Yeah.
Your world and ministry and kind of
Yeah.
investment in these spaces has really evolved
Mhm.
to be something pretty transformational. It's love your enemy.
Mhm.
Like let's get into that.
Yeah, so that's become one of my favorite subjects and uh, things that we get to do.
Yeah.
And it was learned in these kind of conflict areas where we had to engage with people in these insurgent groups and drug cartels who were very powerful and weren't very nice. And I got, not physically, but emotionally, uh, materially beat up. I've had a number of my friends beat up. It's not like I haven't had, people I know that haven't suffered, because I have.
Yeah.
But we lost a lot. We lost a big project some years ago now. It was $1.5 million worth of of income for children that we served, and it was
Wow.
a big tea plantation and pine plantation that we had. Lost it to 20,000 some troops that came in, and this guy
They just took it over. It's
just
like
took
it's
it
ours
over.
now.
Yeah, and he started threatening some of our kids' homes, and it was a tough, long journey. And God really did some really amazing redemptive things through that whole thing. I mean, we could dig into that story, but I think there's another story I want to tell. But what I want to say is, I'm I rallied people to pray for this guy because I
Yeah.
didn't know what else to do, and that's where God brought me to Matthew 5, where it talks about loving your enemies. And
Okay.
I'm like, I don't know what to do. I knew God was telling me to do something, and I'm like, the only thing I have is Jesus commands. So
Okay.
I'm gonna live out Jesus' command of loving my enemy. And because I didn't have access to go after this cartel and this particular individual, Sue, I designed a 3-sentence prayer that anybody could pray, looking about like what this guy would look like if he was actually following Jesus. Like, what would the gifts of God be in him? How would they operate? And so prayed from that kind of a prophetic, positive perspective. And in the process of a couple years of praying for this guy, to my great surprise, God changed my own heart. Because I was convinced that God was going to take care of this really bad guy who was killing lots of people, and instead he was really after me. And I was a shock
That's awesome.
because I'm like, surely God wants to fix the bad dude, not the good dude, right?
Yeah, totally. Come on, Lord.
And instead I realized that my own heart needed a lot of changing.
Yeah.
And the beauty of it was, like, as my own heart started to change for my enemies, then I started to move out of God's heart, and I had a lot more authority to walk in these kinds of spaces and see things happen. And so that was an eye opener. It was a big eye opener for me to begin to see that the favor of God was directly attached to the cleanness of my heart, which came from praying for my enemies. Because how easy is that, right? So it's something, it's like loving your enemies is something that you do by the Spirit of God. In fact, it actually, if you want a good litmus test to see whether you have the Holy Spirit, you need to go through your list of enemies and see how well you love them.
Wow.
And if you're loving them all pretty well, then you're probably full of the Holy Spirit. So if you're just like praying for the sick, well, you're probably operating in the gifts, but I doubt you're full of the Holy Spirit.
Oh, wow. So what did you say? You said loving your enemies is activity that's anointed by, what did you say?
Oh, you're asking me to repeat myself? Oh my goodness.
You said loving your enemies is something that like God initiates, or like it only happens by the Spirit of God.
Yeah, well, it's basically, you can't do it by your own strength. It requires a supernatural God encounter to really truly love your enemy. And this is what I like about it is it's like, this is another way to encounter God.
Yeah.
Because it requires a supernatural activity of the Holy Spirit in your life.
Yeah.
It's a paradox of sorts, and you can't do it outside of God. And so again, it's, that hard stuff I talked about in the beginning. I like the hard stuff. Well, I didn't like volunteer for loving my enemies. I kind of got, tricked into that one maybe, but I'm not regretting it, because when God tricks you into something, it's always good, right? It's like a birthday surprise or something, but it's so amazing because you really do discover God's heart in the middle of it. And then you become an authentic person, which to me is like the true witness of the gospel becomes so much easier.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like the Wurmbrand story, Richard and Sabina Wurmbrand, Voice of the Martyrs, right? It's like, that's high level Christianity.
Yeah.
Easy, hard to do though if people are taking away the resources you're using to serve hundreds of children in need and your mission, and like,
and it hurt. And it hurt for years, and in fact, I remember some years after the Lord asked me one day, he's like, Marcus, would have you been willing to lose $1.5 million for one man's soul? And I was like, ouch, God, that's not fair. Yes, of course, but no, that hurts. It's like, I know what the right answer is, but it's still painful, right?
Well, and especially because that $1.5 million is connected to like hundreds, whatever the number is, thousands of children, lives that you're serving and resourcing. And did you ever see, not that it matters, but I'm so human, I'm asking, did you ever see like that recompense back towards the kids you're resourcing? Number one. Number two, anything with the man himself that you were praying for?
Well, okay, so
and it doesn't matter if it's like, no, I didn't see anything.
I'm trying not to, like tell a whole long story, but I will say that so his second command, was got healed, like it was a divine healing plus and saved. He and his wife both, and they became like strong, Jesus followers in the army. And then that guy got moved out, and the new commander that got put in, who was a Christian hater. I mean, like, he hated Jesus. He burnt churches down. He burnt Bibles. Literally, this guy also didn't get converted, but he decided he liked us.
Okay.
Like, he gave us permission to work in all his space, and that was pretty amazing. It was through the healing of this guy.
Okay.
And so we saw God start to move into this whole space
Yeah.
and change things.
Yeah.
And the other thing I've watched in these kinds of areas is you have to be okay with rhythm, because it's like when you work in these kinds of areas, like, you can see incredible breakthroughs and shifts, and then another war sweeps in and everything looks destroyed. And then from the ashes, you've got leaders that you've worked with who step up and things rebuild again. And like, we're in a broken world, so we have to be okay with the fact that, like think about what's going on, and again, bring it back to, places like Afghanistan. What there's so much getting torn down right now, and people are getting so devastated. It does create a moment where the gospel can come in.
Sure.
And so even though that wouldn't, I don't think, be God's choice or my choice, it does create an opportunity, because war used by the enemy is a self-destructive kind of process, because
Yeah.
at the end there's nothing left except for people to say, oh, help me, God.
Yeah.
Right. And so you get to the bottom of human strength when wars come, and then you don't have anything left to look at but God.
Yeah.
That's the one hope that you can bring back into some of these places.
Wow.
So our gospel becomes really amazing and powerful in these moments. And again, I don't think that's God's heart for war to happen and for things to hit such a low level, but we still have a beautiful answer at the end, that we can at least bring in and give people hope.
Yeah.
So
That's big.
Yeah.
And then
So,
for
go ahead.
those that may be really far removed from these kinds of environments, landscapes, what would you say in terms of how they can engage, contribute? I mean, maybe it's simply the idea of understanding something, like their mindset shifting, and
Sure.
but also practical stuff.
Well, okay. So so there's a couple things. If people have any kind of like intellectual, let's see, can you see it there? Is
Yes.
that coming through clear? Or is it flipping the wrong way?
It's
for you?
coming through clear. So
Okay.
allow violence.
Jacques Ellul, yeah, he's a French philosopher. I think he's passed away now, but he's a tough read. But he thinks a lot about the three powers that I talked about. So he thinks a lot about violence, and so he's just useful if you wanted to just build some frameworks. And then of course I also recommend this book, which is my own. You can find it on Amazon. Love Your Enemy. It's a 30-day guide, and I would say that's a really great starting point.
Yeah.
Frankly, like, if we want to, in my opinion, if we want to see, like, if we want to unravel wars, like when I think about working with children in armed conflict, child soldiers and so on, I'm trying to be preventative, right? I'm trying to give an arena preventative medicine so that it's not going to step into a bigger conflict later on, because we're working with that next generation and teaching them how to be peacemakers. So we're unhooking the cycles of violence that are already in a territory, because cultures get formed in the next generation. That's where the values get set. So the deepest cultural change always happens with children.
Yeah.
So I would say that, what do you do? Well, first, my question to you would be, are you focused at all on that younger generation?
Yeah.
And training them to have the right mindsets so that they know how to unhook conflict and violence. Love Your Enemies is a great way to do that. That 30-day guide I just showed you will start stepping you through a journey on how to love your enemies and start helping you position your heart. So I try to give it in bite-sized pieces that are easy for people to work with. So I would encourage people to start there. And as God's giving them opportunities to love their enemies, then they're really preparing themselves to walk in a spirit that is anti-conflict, anti-murder, anti-war, uh, that gives the church the authority to speak into these things. So Jacques Ellul was very interesting at one point. I can't remember which book I was reading of his, but I remember him commenting that he said if the church had prayed more, we would have taken out the spirit of Nazism. Instead, we were too busy fighting.
Wow.
So I know there's a lot of, like question marks in people's minds when you pick up arms and when you not pick up arms, and when do we fight and when we don't. And I'm not going to be able to solve that problem for you, but what I can say is that we can, as a church, move in more authority than we do.
Yeah.
And our prayers are going to have more authority when our actions, when we practice what we preach, right? When we're actually loving enemies, then we're going to have authority to shift heaven.
Yeah.
And so if we're really worried about how to deal with war and violence and conflict, it first starts, I believe, like King David, man after God's own heart. What does that mean? It meant that God could do things because the guy had the right kind of heart. He could build a kingdom around him.
Yeah.
So, yeah. That's
and that's an interesting segue to violence. Like the Lord really he wasn't into him building the temple because he was a man of violence. And
true.
yet,
It still marked him, right?
And yet the lineage, like his lineage was somebody who's a leader in peace. Like, okay, this person can build a dwelling place for me. That's interesting. We talk about society pushing forward only through violent tendencies.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, you see it in the Old Testament too.
Because I think that's a surprising thought when you're reading the Old Testament and if you don't know the Christian story, it's like, wow, that's crazy. David, a man after God's heart, and the Lord's like, not you, your son.
Yeah.
That's a surprising kind of moment where you're like, oh, okay, God is actually a God of peace.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Well, I think for me that boils back down to another kind of thing to understand is like, I would always tell my students over in Southeast Asia that had to do, just to survive, they had to lie a lot because they were stateless, paperless people. There were so many challenges they had to get through. And I say, listen, I'm not going to tell you you can't lie to a border guard because you're trying to survive. But what I'm going to tell you is you need to understand every time you lie, it's a break of trust.
Wow.
And that still impacts the world. And so that's, when we bring it into the realm of violence, it's the same thing. It's like, what we need to understand is if you kill somebody, there's still a consequence. There was still blood on David's hands, even though David knew how to love his enemy Saul, right? It's like Saul was probably his worst enemy for years.
Yeah.
He could honor him, and because that, God could trust David in a place of kingship.
Yeah.
But at the same time, David did kill people in war, and that did mark him. There was still a consequence.
Yeah.
And I think we have to, as a church, realize every time we lift our hands and shed blood, innocent or not innocent blood, there's still a consequence on our souls. We weren't made for death. Again, we weren't made for this. So we don't want to participate in it unless we're absolutely forced into a corner.
Yeah. It's good. Well, such good thoughts. Really, really inspiring. Again, I like, for those that may not know Marcus super well, you can hear as he's sharing, he's such a father in the justice movement. He's definitely a forerunner for so many of us. He's somebody that a lot of us look to for wisdom and insight. And it's really fun talking at this level, just hearing how you're thinking big picture, and also knowing that it's not just philosophy to you. You're like, you work on the ground in so many different places. Like you're a man of action, and just appreciate you spending time with us. So I think probably that's the best way people can find you, is your book on Amazon. Is there anything else if people want to find you and get connected to you? Or
Yeah, well, they can. I don't know if there's something you can flash up on the screen later, but if they went to in-fire.org, in-fire.org, they can get to one of our websites that kind of gives a flavor of some of the things we do and places we're at. And so that, if they're interested in kind of chasing more of what we do.
Great.
But yeah.
That's perfect. Yeah, this has been a really rich conversation. Thanks for taking time with us, Mark. It's always good to see you. Keep up the good work, strength and peace and
Thank you,
grace
Frank.
for all that you're doing. Love you so much.
Love you too,
And we'll
friend.
say goodbye. Okay. Peace.
Peace.
All right. Thank you.
Bye-bye.